Welcome to Global Horizons Virtual and the fifth of a five-part webcast series leading up to the 36th Annual Global Horizons Conference in London 2021. Both result from a unique partnership between Oxford Analytica, the pioneer of geopolitical analysis, and the Conference Board, the leading business think tank providing insights for what's ahead. Today, we'll discuss how COVID-19 is impacting global supply chains and what might trade policy look like following the pandemic. Please engage in this important conversation by asking questions, downloading the presentation, and sharing this program with colleagues. If you are requesting credits, click the 3 pop-up boxes throughout the program. Now, Global Horizons Virtual.
Vote.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on COVID-19 and the future of global supply chains. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Stina Wangstam-Drolet, and I am delighted to be co-moderating today's panel with my colleague at the Conference Board, Eric Lund. This is the 5th webinar in our ongoing series of virtual events in the run-up to our in-person Global Horizons conference. And if everything goes as planned, this will be held in London in March next year. Oxford Analytica has held the Global Horizons Conference for 35 years, and this year we are very excited to be partnering with our colleagues at the Conference Board to host the event. A special thank you to EY, who are the sponsors of Global Horizons. Before I hand over to Eric to introduce our excellent panel and today's topic, let me just highlight a couple of things. This is meant to be an interactive webcast, so please do ask questions in the chat box. Eric and I will be monitoring this throughout, and we will do our very best to get those questions to our panelists. And as with previous webinars in this series, we will have audience poll questions to get your thoughts on the discussion topics. We have 2 of these planned for today's webinar, and once the poll results come in, we'll ask our panelists to offer their reflections on your responses. And just finally, for those of you who are eligible for credits, you may apply for those, and there'll be instructions on your screen on how to do that. I think that's all for me for now, so let me hand over to Eric. Eric, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stina. Welcome, everyone, our distinguished panelists, and of course the audience. So as you are all aware, today we're going to be talking a little bit about COVID-19 and the impact on global value chains and global trade policy more broadly. So there are a couple of topics that we're really going to try to address. The first is how is COVID-19 impacting global supply chains and which sectors have been hit the hardest? How fragile are supply chains and how are robust supply chains established? How will investment in technology and sustainability considerations alter supply chain decisions in the post-pandemic world? And finally, what might trade policy look like following the COVID-19 pandemic? I want to quickly introduce the panel that we have here today. It's a fantastic group. Joining us from MIT is Alexis Bateman. She is a research scientist and director for sustainable supply chains. Alexis, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We have Douglas Bell, who is the global trade policy leader at Ernst & Young. Doug, welcome. Mike Dickinson from Boeing joins us, where he leads the manufacturing business office. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Chris Etry with Dell Technologies. Chris is the Director for Social and Environmental Responsibility within the supply chain team. Chris, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be here.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to hand back over to Stina. She's going to go over a poll question, and then we'll launch into the main topic of the webcast.
Thanks, Eric. Let's get ready for the first question. It should be coming up on your screen now. So the question is, among the following options, which of these manufacturing industry supply chains do you think are seeing the most disruption from COVID-19? Your options are automotive, information and communication technologies, pharmaceutical and medical devices, food and beverage, chemical products, and I think those are the ones. So please get voting. We'll give you a few seconds to make your choice. All right. So let's close the poll now and let's see how you voted. So we can see that pretty split. The winning, well, most of you thought automotive will be most disrupted, closely followed by pharmaceutical and food and beverage. Alexis, perhaps I can turn to you first. 20 seconds. Are you surprised by the results?
No, actually, they're exactly what I would have expected to see, in particular pharmaceuticals and medical devices and food and beverage, by virtue of where certain, materials lie in pharmaceuticals. There's been a lot of disruption, so I think that they've seen that as getting materials out of, countries that are on lockdown, right, and as that has kind of progressed across the world, I've seen significant disruptions there. And then food and beverage, huge challenges there, absolutely, and in particular because of labor that's involved, and a lot of frontline labor, kind of the risk involved in food and beverage, and moving that in a traditional fashion, trying to building a lot more capabilities there. So yeah, not surprising.
Great, thanks. Chris, your brief reaction, please.
So it's interesting. I mean, to me, global supply chains, by their very nature, are complex and subject to significant disruptions all the time. Clearly, this terrible pandemic is a more severe disruption than many of us have come through. But I think during this session, it's going to be interesting to think through, not just in terms of the level of disruption, but actually the level of response that has come out of different industries. And for me, being based in the ICT sector, I think we've got a strong position in terms of, being able to weather some of the disruptions and be able to deliver to market. And I think it'll be interesting to explore that during this session.
Looking forward to that, Chris. Thank you so much. Let's get into a bit more detail, and perhaps, Doug, if I may turn to you. So it is clear that COVID-19 is impacting every industry differently. What do you think are the major COVID-19 related factors impacting global supply chains? And to what extent do you think these factors vary from one industry to another?
Well, thank you, Stena. It's a really interesting question, because I think one of the real different elements around COVID is just how multidimensional it is in comparison to some other global events that we've had. So, if you sort of unpack that and look at what are some of those factors, I think you probably want to start off with the shock to demand. And that plays both ways, of course, right? We've seen huge increase in demand for personal protective equipment, PPE, but also things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, at least if you're sitting in the United States. Bicycles are hard to come by, right? Because of real change in consumer preference. And then, of course, a lot of what we read about, and I think we're all experiencing, is the decline in demand, and how dramatic that has been in terms of, so the types of fall and overall GDP growth and such. I mean, these are huge numbers and are really creating a real challenge for businesses. And obviously that has huge implications for supply chains, production planning, et cetera. I think the second item I would identify is sort of the very specific public health measures. So, whether it's social distancing, reconfiguring of workplaces, accuracy in logistics, air and sea travel. We also see government responses and government policies that are definitely making a difference. So not only the aforementioned social distancing, but we see export restrictions, which is showing up in the trade policy space. We've seen increasing levels of trade protectionism, government procurement limitations, and we've also seen at really the macro level, significant fiscal and monetary policy changes. Those all trickle through in sometimes meaningful ways through the economy as well. And kind of turning back to sort of the government policies, you've also seen a real change in the discourse, right? I'm sure many of you noted that when the Biden campaign launched one of its first economic speeches last week, one of the key pillars, and they actually had a paper devoted to this, was the supply chains. When's the last time we've seen that as part of a presidential campaign? Never. So that represents a real shift So the other factors that I would just allude to, one is sort of the health of the lower tier supply chain. That's a function of revenue and impact, but that also I think is complicated, particularly for folks, OEMs and higher up in the supply chain. And then the other factor I think is COVID has really accelerated a lot of existing trends. It hasn't happened in a vacuum. So you have some of those are economic trends, so convergence, labor rates, changing consumer preferences. We've always had e-commerce has been part of our life for a while now, but it's on steroids in the current environment. Changing preferences like farm to table, all of those have impacts on supply chains as well. And then lastly, sort of our cross-border tensions that we've seen, for example, with the U.S. and China. The pandemic has sort of exacerbated those. So by and large, as I mentioned, sort of this more complicated environment, which was already complex, has become even more so. And really, we see it on a lot of different dimensions. And I think that sort of that, multifaceted, when firms think about, how to respond, and I'm sure we'll get into this, requires a concurrent, complex response and solution, and how to evaluate, how to respond to these.
Got it. Thank you, Doug. I hope you were able to hear all of that, although you were fading out a little bit, Doug. Perhaps I can turn to you next, Mike. What are your thoughts and reactions? Do you agree with Douglas? Are there trends and factors that you would highlight as well?
Yeah, Doug covered a very broad aspects of a number of different places where it's impacting. In aerospace, in air travel, clearly, huge decrease, international travel going down to by 80% year over year. Even domestic travel down roughly 60% year over year, even today, and that's hit across the whole industry, and both Airbus and Boeing, our supply chains intersect and are global. What we've seen, the companies that are getting more impacted, there's been a lot of consolidation in our industry over the last 5 to 10 years, where larger companies are buying up the smaller companies, trying to be more competitive. So what we're seeing is those tier 2 and tier 3 companies down in the supply chain are the ones that don't have the financial strength to be able to weather the issues with the lower demand. So we've been keeping that visible and checking on them and looking for what kind of help we can provide. The other is some of the suppliers that are very specialized. For instance, if they only do things that are for commercial aerospace versus something that is assets can be reutilized. So as an example, the aluminum mills can shift. Aerospace is a very small percentage of total aluminum output. They can shift their output and go produce something else. Whereas carbon fiber, a single airplane 787's worth of carbon fiber is probably more than a year's worth of carbon fiber you need to make fishing poles or tennis rackets. So, for people that can shift those assets, they're weathering better. The other is kind of the concentration of the market, where we've seen, for instance, the commodity type markets like small machining houses and sheet metal houses, where there's a low barrier entry. There's very many suppliers out there. They run on thinner margins, and so they've been a little bit more impacted by this than where there's concentration, where there's only 1 or 2 players in the market that can still command a hold in the market.
Hey, Mike, I'm gonna pop in here real quick because I wanted to pick your brain on this. Boeing is such a huge manufacturer here in the U.S. And there's been a lot of talk in the media about the fragility of supply chains and the disruptions that various businesses are seeing given what's going on worldwide. Could you talk a little bit about how Boeing has worked to try to build robust supply chains and resiliency and how you're faring, maybe not as necessarily as a company, but how manufacturing is faring in terms of grappling with this?
Yeah, sure, Eric. So where we've always maintained a good visibility of the financial and production health of our supply chain, and what we're doing now is we're seeing, as I mentioned before, the tier 2 and the tier 3, which we don't always have good visibility of. We're now increasing that visibility so that we can go make sure that we see where the risk is, try and be more predictable relative to who might need help, and then reach out to them to be able to offer potentially difference in payment terms or delivery or ship in place type of things, so that we can make sure, or even help them get a better line of credit. We're also reaching out to support them, but one of the things that we're continuing to do is do more multi-sourcing. So we went through a phase where we were looking for cost reductions in the supply chain, and there was the opportunity to be able to lock in long-term agreements, oftentimes sole source, for large benefits in price. And we realized that as we did that over a period of time, now many of the things that are sole source, we now need to go unwind as the contracts come open and go start doing more multi-source, sometimes doing some internal and some external, just so that we can maintain competition in the space.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mike. I wanted to pivot over and ask Chris a similar question. Chris, actually, we spoke a little bit yesterday about maybe the kind of fragility that people are talking about in supply chains is overhyped a little bit. You said that you thought that maybe they were a little bit more robust than people gave them credit for. Could you talk a little bit about Dell Technologies and ICT manufacturing and things like that more broadly in terms of how the supply chains have been impacted in that industry?
Yeah, of course, Eric. I mean, I think I wouldn't ever want to underestimate how serious and how big an impact COVID has had. I mean, clearly it's a kind of global pandemic that is impacting on all of us. I think at the same time, and if we think back to, say, February, when we began to see the first elements of this pandemic starting around Lunar New Year, I think at the time we were sort of reading quite a lot of newspaper reports that were talking about kind of the supply chains, potentially collapsing because of people not being able to get back to their areas of work and areas like that. And I think what we've seen over this period is, along the lines of what Mike said. I mean, you've seen companies diving into tier 2, tier 3s of their supply chains in order to work together with their suppliers to try and find a solution. I mean, speaking more specifically from my point of view, managing social and environmental responsibility, I mean, we are talking to the leadership teams of supplier facilities to kind of assure ourselves that their workplaces are sanitized, they have social distancing in place, they have the right tools in place so that the people who work at that site can come back safely. And so that's been a kind of key concern that we've managed throughout the process. And I think at the same time, we've also been able to use different mechanisms we have to reach out to people working our supply chain to make sure they're informed on the risk. So, I don't underestimate that all the challenges that are going to happen to business, both now into the future, but I think so far we've seen many, many strong examples of businesses being able to adapt to the disruption and trying to find solutions in unprecedented times. And I think we'll continue to see these, and I think kind of a broad brush approach in terms of just talking about the fragility of supply chains is missing an important nuance in this case.
Thank you.
Well, staying on the theme of sustainability, perhaps, Alexis, I'd love to hear your perspective as a researcher in supply chain sustainability at the MIT. How do you think investment in technology and sustainability considerations will change supply chain decisions in a post-COVID world?
Sure. So, obviously a very easy and straightforward answer to that, but really joking aside, that I think that it's going to be, it depends across different industries that are being impacted, how they were impacted, and what capabilities they have in the next, towards the end of 2020 and as we moved into 21 and 22. So I think that, as far as we've been researching, we've actually been surprised when we've just done, simple polls of professionals and executives about how they tend to, or they're planning to invest in supply chain sustainability. And, I think that in some cases there's going to be a pulling back of investment depending on how it, what the ROI looks in, whether it's environmental technologies of reducing environmental impact in form of emissions or water use or pollutants in the air or other kind of controlling technologies. That those will likely still be in place because there's existing environmental regulations or that's helping them in some way. There's other kind of investment that can happen as a result of what Chris was talking about, which was getting visibility into the supply chain to work more closely with your upstream suppliers to know both, have a risk reduction strategy, but also being able to work with them to ensure, a quality quality working environment, and in that way also kind of reducing any misinformation that's coming down the line and working closer with your upstream suppliers. So I think that in some cases, sustainability investment is risk reduction investment. So given the disruption that everyone is experiencing, that I think those investments are going to go up. But there may be some that are seen as non-critical, and recognizing that everyone is very has spending holds and is kind of pulling back on major investment. The ones that may have moved forward with if COVID hadn't hit, right, are likely to be on hold at least for the next year or so, right? And so we may see sort of a pause on some that were not already in motion, and maybe towards the 21, 22 we might see a return. From my perspective, and one that I've been tracking sustainability and supply chains for the last decade, that I think that it's not forever. It's a pause as we're all kind of revisiting our strategies and our how we cope in these different changing environments. So I think that there's going to be different focus as we move forward. But even Mistina, maybe you know this better, having looked at ESG. But of course, everyone's digging into the data to see, are those that are performing better on ESG metrics, are they performing better right now? And of course, the quick feedback was yes, right? So of course, we have to take that with a grain of salt on, how valid all the ESG metrics are, but that, firms that rated higher on ESG factors perform better, and that may be for a variety of reasons, whether they already had existing visibility into the supply chain to ensure where their materials and their products were coming from, and they had closer relationships with their suppliers, so the suppliers were able to supply to them despite disruption, or they figured things out. So I think there's a lot of information coming out of this disruption that actually just from my perspective, of course, that's not blanket across all cases or all industries, but actually further supports the rationale to invest more deeply in sustainability.
I want to interject here real quick. I know that we want to ask Chris the same question, but I heard, Alexis, you and a number of other people talk about the importance of sort of peering up the value chains, second, third tier. And we have a question from the audience about how exactly you accomplish this. I don't know, Mike, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the strategies and the tools that Boeing uses to try to be able to unravel this very complex supply chain that you were talking about?
Well, so we've always had a system directly linking to our tier one suppliers, but what we're expanding on now is rapidly trying to get into help the suppliers understand where their risks are in their sub-tier chain. So essentially, in the time frame that we've had to be able to go implement something, it's really been good old-fashioned get on the phone and talk to people. So really ending up with a daily or a minimum weekly cadence of connecting with each one of the suppliers and having conversations around where they're seeing issues, if there's anybody that's distressed, or if we're seeing somebody that's distressed and then asking another supplier, we think they're in your supply chain, you might want to go check on them too. So some of this is just cross-referencing and making sure that we're able to help each other through the process.
Chris, what's Dell's sort of tactic in this area in terms of how do you accomplish being able to look 2, 3, 4 tiers up?
So I think, like Mike, we've built a very strong bond with our direct suppliers and as a result managed to use that as a way to kind of pivot up our supply chain. We also, the way that we're structured, we do have the opportunity to touch directly tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. So, it's not just always a case of trying to impose our standards via our suppliers. We also have some relationships in place. And I think the other aspect that's really key here is cross-sector collaboration. And so within the tech sector, we're very fortunate that we operate to a same set of standards that are defined by the Responsible Business Alliance, which is made up of over 100 members of the tech sector, as well as members in the toy industry and the car industry who are increasingly using more and more electronics. And so, we're in a situation there, as part of that association, we're able to have conversations with people 3 or 4 tiers up from our business, but essentially we're all looking to deploy the same standards. And having that cross-sector collaboration makes an enormous difference, because otherwise, people aren't exactly sure in terms of what direction they need to go to or what's their priority.
That's really interesting. Chris, I wondered if we could ask you to comment a bit more about the role of technology in the future supply chains.
Yeah, I think, as sort of Alexis talked about, there's this real challenge in terms of the way that business is going to be impacted by COVID and thinking through the level of investment that needs to be made. It's that kind of fundamental element that we've touched upon, that resilience relates to managing risk, and the best way to manage risk is to get information and data ahead of time so that you can mitigate it. And, I think this is why, for, especially in Dell, we're going to continue to invest in our sustainability programs, because it's demonstrated to us that we're able to solve the issues and anticipate them as they come up. I'm not going to say that we necessarily were able to predict something like COVID is coming up, but very often, we are able to take the signals from our supply chain around the world and be able to start building some mitigation, and that's not necessarily just in the responsibility area, that can be in other parts of the business. From a technology perspective, I think there's the 3 sort of elements I'd touch on as an insight for this group. One is, not necessarily trying to build alone, but build off existing tools. There's already a lot of very good tools that are out there. For example, in China, the IPE provide a lot of tools on an environmental side, and so from the Dell perspective, we don't just try and create a tool to monitor environmental risk in China. We use the IPE as a way of mapping that risk. Of course, there's that opportunity in terms of innovation. So, we're currently piloting some work in blockchain to understand the opportunities that are aside from that. My personal read at the moment is it's a very bespoke process. I know there's some different off-the-shelf applications, but that's going to be very challenging to deploy across sectors, especially in the sense of trying to build an interface for the blockchain at a level in which we're able to capture meaningful information that enables the fundamental traceability that comes from blockchain. And I think at the same time, there's just operationalizing, I think, what Mike described well, which is just being able to build a platform in which we and our suppliers are able to exchange regularly so that we're able to share the information and follow up all the actions that we would take. I think the only thing I would maybe add a little bit from what Alexis said, certainly on the environmental side, we continue to see the same standards existing. But I think on a social side, just all the developments happening in Europe at the moment, the EU are looking to pass a mandatory due diligence on human rights in 2021. And I think, at the moment when you're talking to DG Just who are trying to develop that legislation, they're thinking of that in the same way as GDPR worked for data privacy. So rather than just an act aimed at European companies, but an act that's so stringent that it kind of forces the tide to rise everywhere. And so I think, there's a question of can companies afford to invest in sustainability programs, but there's also a question of can companies afford not to invest in those, given they'll have to meet new legislation in the future.
That's really interesting, Chris. Alexis, can I ask for your comments on that?
Yeah, you're not going to get an argumentative answer out of me. I agree on all fronts. Obviously that we're seeing, and of course we can't, no blanket statements here, right? Every company, every industry is being different, impacted differently based on demand, either increasing or decreasing. And so the capabilities to change anything is obviously, pretty heavily embedded in how you're being impacted, how you're able to, maintain your same, staffing and workforce, right? But I think that Chris hit it on the head, which in some cases you're seeing that those that had sustainability initiatives already in place were able to rebound faster, and certainly with existing regulation, and those that may be, on the forefront, especially if, domestically in the United States, right? If, the administration changes hands, right? Certainly the impacts are going to change there, and across Europe, right? There's certainly a greater focus on, a green or more sustainable recovery, right? As we emerge from COVID, so I think that there's just really in some ways, it's forcing of the hand. Hopefully, in many cases, it's strategic, right? And those that already saw that, especially for like the frontline laborers, right? We've seen a lot of focus around, the frontline laborers, whether that be, delivering to your home, whether that be, at the grocery stores, whether that be, out in the fields and continuing food production, right? Those that already had good support systems in place for those laborers, they've been able to kind of recover faster in terms of production and had less, media headlines about their processes. And of course, media is just one dimension to this, but it's not insubstantial, right? And some of the research we've seen and some that we've conducted as well is that media does have influence on consumer perception, and that does have long-term implications for trust and purchase practices for consumers. And so I think there's a lot swirling around here, but in some, very much agree with what Chris was saying.
Great, thanks, Alexis. Perhaps, Mike, if I could bring you in just very briefly, your perspective on the sustainability considerations from Boeing.
Yeah, it's, I think a lot of what we're wrestling with at this point is from a sustainability standpoint, as this impacts a broad swath of manufacturing, and people have to scale down to be able to survive from a financial standpoint. What's it look like when they try to scale back up again, and whether or not that becomes another problem in and of itself. It's a tricky balance of trying to be able to play the long game. At the same time, that it's going to be roughly 2 or 3 years before we get back to that same level of air travel that we were at in 2019, just before COVID hit.
Thanks so much, Mike.
We have another topic, but I want to actually introduce a quick question that I have for Doug, Chris, Mike, and Alexis. A lot when we talk about supply chains and value chains, for the most part, people think about manufacturing. You have the fragmentation of manufacturing that took place in the 1990s and 2000s, and the eruption of sort of the flow of intermediate inputs as a function of that. But we're hearing more and more about the possible fragmentation of services moving forward. So many people currently are working from home. They're remote working, and I think it's demonstrating to a lot of businesses that physical sort of co-location of services production doesn't necessarily have to be done inside of a single office. So looking forward over the next couple of years, do you see the potential for COVID-19 to kind of accelerate service production fragmentation in a similar way that we saw manufacturing fragmented in the 90s and 2000s? It's an open question to anyone who's willing to tackle it.
I'm happy to have a first sort of point. I mean, I think part of what we're talking about here is, I think Doug articulated it very well at the outset, which is, it's not a question of change. I mean, I think most businesses have had a view in terms of there are evolving trends, but the challenge is the speed of the change. And certainly, we've seen the movement to home working, the movement to virtual, move so much quicker than anyone could have anticipated. Then at the same time, though, I mean, many companies have actually been able to build the infrastructure to be able to work effectively in that mode very quickly. And so, probably happening quicker than we would have thought so if they planned it through. I think the other thing you've got to kind of partner up with, Eric, when you're thinking about just the impact from COVID, is also just think about the impact of automation on the service environment, because I mean that for me is something that is straight away going to remove an awful lot of the nature of the way that services were deployed in the past. And it'd be interesting, I think, from the perspective of COVID, to see that similarly gets accelerated.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about the automation dimension of that as well. Doug, did you have any thoughts on services and maybe what's ahead for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris actually, I maybe put a slightly finer point on it. I think it's going to be the nexus between the pandemic and social distancing and technology. So whether it's AI, digital, automation that's been mentioned, I think all of those things are going to transform services. If you look at sort of the macro picture, a lot of the productivity improvement that we've seen over the decades has been in the manufacturing sector. Services always lagged a bit, and there's good reasons for that. But I think it's sort of ripe for kind of new paradigms, new business models, and as I think your question highlights, COVID is sort of accelerating that and highlighted maybe some of the opportunities, but obviously some of the risks as well.
I want to pivot a little bit again. We have another poll question for the audience. We want to talk a little bit about policy moving forward, but I wanted to get some perspective again on what the audience is thinking. Can we pull that question up, please? So the question is, how confident are you that your organization can successfully navigate the supply chain disruptions resulting from COVID-19? We have options ranging from very confident, somewhat confident, neutral, not so confident, and not confident at all. So why don't you take a moment or two and let us know how you're feeling and what you're seeing within your individual businesses, and then maybe we can get some of our panelists to weigh in on what they think. So let's go ahead and maybe close that poll. All right. So I'm seeing about half of the audience feel somewhat confident, which is pretty reassuring. And then we have a skew there to very confident to the tune of about 33%. So only about 16 and change feel neutral to not so confident. So it looks like there's a lot of confidence, a lot of optimism here. I was wondering if perhaps I could get a response from Alexis. Is this surprising to you at all, or?
You read my face. I was like, wow, we got a lot of really confident people in this group. So, I mean, certainly that's surprising to me. I think we've asked similar questions to some of our professionals that we work with and that we've engaged with in different webinars, and I think it's been a little bit skewed downward from what's here, so that's great. Certainly would be interested to see what the makeup of the group is and industries and where they're based, but I think, if we'd asked this question 2 months ago and people were seeing COVID as sort of a temporary disruption, the impacts were not really, I would say 2 to 3 months ago, the impacts were still being seen, right? We didn't really know what was coming, but now that we're weathering this and knowing it's for the long term, I'm seeing that obviously, businesses and firms are really kind of being more agile and pivoting and figuring out what their long game is here. So I suspect that this is a virtue of time, that now, whether we see this is going to last for the duration of time, that, strategies have been collected, control towers or, kind of emergency management systems are kind of being rolled out, right? So then there's a lot more kind of capabilities in place to deal with this, not just for the short term. So I think this is a virtue of time, but also happy to see that we have a very confident group.
It is reassuring. Chris, what's your take on this? Is this about what you expected, or slightly more optimistic than you thought it would be?
I'm really encouraged by the poll, actually. I mean, I mean, clearly, when we've been through such an incident that doesn't just impact on our professional lives, but really impacts on our personal lives as well, I mean, it is significant obstacles to overcome, and I think that I'm very encouraged by the fact that, I would align with this, that we need to step kind of confidently forward in terms of continuing to manage the disruption that will come from the pandemic. I mean, I think, we can't be 100% sure where it's going to move us because, there's lots of other factors that are out there in terms of how things can develop throughout the world. I mean, it's been happening at different paces at different places. But I think, again, sort of seeing what we've done today in terms of managing it, I think people have taken on board a lot of the initial questions or challenges that came on board. I don't think there's a CSO in the world who isn't right now got a dedicated team working out every single part of their supply chain right up to their materials, and so all that information, is going to be taken on board and help us, if we do get hit by a second wave or there's another incident, that we'll be in a better position to manage it. I think, again, sort of coming back to the initial question that we had in the poll, I mean, to me, this isn't a question of build back better, which is this sort of tagline that we're seeing in many other places. It's what we always want to keep doing, which is building forwards effectively. And so, we don't want to recreate what we've already done. We want to be able to create something new that's going to help us to be more effective in the future.
Thanks very much, Chris. The topic of politics, of trade tensions has come up a couple different times. Of course, presently everyone's focused on COVID-19 and the disruption that's associated with that. But I think we have to remember that sort of walking into this over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a lot of political sort of volatility and uncertainty in terms of U.S.-China, NAFTA, even EU-U.S. Trade relations were subject to threat and uncertainty. So it begs the question, as COVID-19 gradually and eventually subsides, as in terms of the disruptions that it's causing within the supply chain world, what possible political environment might emerge from this? Are we going to go back to a situation where there's hostility, where the WTO is being not utilized maybe 100% in the way that it has been historically? Are we going to see bilateral trade agreements and trends continue to maybe take the forefront? What's ahead, Doug? Maybe you can tackle that a little bit. What kind of political environment are you seeing, and what are you telling your clients about how to prepare for it?
Well, I think uncertainty is sort of the watchword here. And you mentioned that, will we go back to, level of tension? I would argue we've never departed from that. And if anything, those tensions have become more exacerbated. If you think about U.S.-China, for example, you have 2 aircraft carriers sitting in the South China Sea right now. So these are economic tensions, but they're also, much broader. I do see, in policy terms, some very intense pressures that are probably not going to be pandemic related. But if you think about, it's always been the case that protectionist pressures increase in times of economic dislocation, and particularly severe economic dislocation. And we're really at a point now where sort of our global economic governance is really not functioning, certainly not in the way that we saw, for example, even as recently in 2008, 2009. So, if we were lacking discipline. You sort of mentioned the WTO, sort of its ineffectiveness, lack of trying, of course, but its ability to sort of curtail behavior. So, I think that we're going to see a continuation of that. If we do see a change in the U.S. administration, obviously that'll have some impact. And you could foresee.
Doug, I apologize. We're having a bit of a hard time hearing you. I'm going to pivot a little bit. Mike Dickinson at Boeing, same question. What are you thinking in terms of what's ahead in terms of trade policy? I know that Boeing, people look at this, your company, in terms of a possible chip in the U.S.-China frictions. What are you expecting in 2021 in terms of that kind of volatility?
Yeah, with Boeing being U.S.'s largest exporter, it tends to get into where we get into a position where we are a part of that negotiation, whether we like it or not. I think we have seen a lot of fragmentation, nationalization. You've seen the EU relative to Brexit. You've seen EU with the tensions relative to Turkey buying Russian missiles. You have China, U.S. We had Russia and U.S. just a few years ago, 2-3 years ago. I think it's hard to predict where it's going to go. So in the aerospace, the countries are often our customer, and sometimes they're also the regulator. So because we're selling both military and commercial assets. So from that aspect, you have to plan for the long game and understand. We have direct relationships with the governments in each of the countries, each of the regions, and build that long-term relationship so that regardless of whether or not there's tensions going on a political front, the relationship is still there relative to the company to the country. And we've done that. It's been essentially our approach for a long period of time. How to mitigate for these fluctuations, I think, as we've seen tariffs rise and tensions change related to the WTO case, et cetera, I think it's more about managing that long-term risk and identifying where we have too much concentration possibly, and looking for, again, making our supply chain more robust by having multiple sources so that we don't end up with, if something goes horribly sideways for a period of time with a particular country, that it doesn't cut off our supply chain. We've got other ways of dealing with it. So from a longer standpoint, it's really managing risk through where there's too much concentration and making sure that we can address it that way.
Doug, you've turned your webcam off, and I think we've made some progress in terms of the audio. Why don't you pick back up if you can? Let's see how you sound. Just try to speak loudly.
Sure. So, sound okay? Okay, I'll speak loudly. So, where I was going to just, and I think this complements what we just like as well, is that, that type of uncertainty, policy uncertainty, we're in a different world now, is going to continue. Combine that with the pandemic, the climate change.
Doug, I hate to do this to you. I really want to hear what you have to say, but it's very challenging, and I apologize. I'm going to pivot a little bit. Alexis, I know maybe this isn't in your wheelhouse, but what are your thoughts in terms of the policy volatility and with the U.S. elections coming up later in the year? Could we potentially see a change in how the U.S. is conducting trade policy if a new administration comes into the White House?
Well, I won't say specifically what I think that will look like, because I think no one knows, right, obviously, because we're amidst so many different disruptions, right? So not only COVID, certainly there's significant social tensions here in the United States, right? There's a lot of different issues impacting how, even, trade and kind of planning will go there. But I can address it, I would say, from a supply chain management perspective, which would be how companies are being responsive to that. And I think that in that way, there is a lot of refocusing on having exclusively global supply chains, right? And maybe potentially looking at building capabilities more locally or regionally, domestically, right? So then they can have local sourcing on top of who they're sourcing from globally, right? So I think that there has been a recognition that in some cases, certain supply chains, certain materials, certain products do have high levels of risk when, the suppliers are concentrated in a certain part of the world and there can be potential disruption there, right? So even if we're thinking about China, right, that, you can have like a China +1 strategy where you're not exclusively sourcing from China, but whether you want to source somewhere else in Southeast Asia or particularly look at locally, right, in case that worst case scenario you couldn't get it, from a certain region. So I think that the unknowns are significant, right? So having a kind of diverse portfolio of suppliers is becoming, very strategic. Obviously, it always was, but I think that's more critical going forward. And in some cases, obviously, and Chris and Mike work in industries that have their need advanced capabilities you can't really pivot that quickly, right? Whereas something like apparel, right, you might be able to pivot pretty quickly because capabilities are a little differently. So I'd say that it's going to be a mixed bag across industries, but I won't pretend to speak like I know what's going to happen, early next year. But that's what I would think from the supply chain side.
And you brought something really interesting up that resonated with me, and that the audience has touched on a little bit. And the idea of sort of localization of supply chains, or if you want to call it reshoring or onshoring. There's a couple different ways of sort of addressing that topic. At the Conference Board, we've been doing some research over the last couple of years on this, and we've seen that some of the share of gross output in a lot of manufacturing has been increasingly sourced locally, coming into a sort of COVID-19. There's been a sort of a shortening of supply chains within manufacturing, especially in advanced economies, and also in China as well. What do we think about that in terms of this localization or regionalization? Clusters of manufacturing kind of retrenching themselves in places like North America, East Asia, and within Europe itself, as opposed to this sort of sprawling global manufacturing networks that we saw in the 90s and 2000s develop.
Do you want me to answer that, or I can punt that to Chris or Mike?
Have at it.
I'll start, I suppose, but
sure.
I'll just speak more, on local sourcing in general, which, and I hate to be the it depends person, but I'd certainly say it depends on what the capabilities are in the near term to pivot. But I think that certainly, in the food industry in particular, we've seen some, local sourcing move closer to home, right, because of the disruptions caused and getting things on the shelf. And so in terms of manufacturing, I think that's a longer end game, right, because you need to shift the capabilities, and I think that could possibly be a supply chain redesign component that's occurring right now, right? So I don't think that that's happening, overnight, obviously, but I think that we're seeing a revisiting of local opportunities, local sourcing, local suppliers. We are doing some work on small and diverse suppliers as key opportunities, that those that are able to be more agile and potentially local and the way that they're kind of serving their customers. So I think that there's a lot of new opportunities to explore here that the companies are kind of capitalizing on. So not sure I got to the point there, but maybe Chris and Mike can fill it in.
That was great. Chris, Mike, any thoughts on trends within this sort of localization concept? Is this something that you're witnessing at your own companies, or what are your thoughts on this trend?
I'd say we're probably
Chris?
going in the sorry. Oh, so I'd say we're probably actually going in the opposite direction. Where the airplane sales are for commercial airplanes is where large populations are middle class and beginning to travel more. So you end up with China, India, Turkey being major hubs and areas of growth. And so we actually expect over time to be able to expand our manufacturing capabilities to be more local in the markets that we're dealing in, so that we're a local name and we're a local part of those markets that we're trying to tap into.
I'd say I'd say from the technology side, it's nice. It's got an interesting compare and contrast. I mean, from the technology side, I mean, Dell's kind of maintained a global footprint and is kind of one of the few technology manufacturers who's got their own in-house facilities around the world. So, we've kind of maintained that global footprint because, partly because of the strains and the resilience that we want to have in place in terms of servicing our customers. But also, I think, we're fortunate to be in that situation where, we're able to run our products and be able to manage something effectively across a broader spectrum. So, I think, from the technology perspective, I don't imagine that there'll be any sense of wanting to try to close that down. I think we'll continue to want to continue that global footprint because, I mean, essentially, we're in that situation, especially with the trends accelerating in terms of automation and areas like AI, where you're going to see more and more technology support required, not just in terms of providing the products, but making sure they're serviced and supported to the level that they need to be given the amount of data that's going to be created.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. I know that Doug has rejoined us after shutting his computer down and rebooting. Doug, why don't we give you one last chance to comment a little bit on the geopolitics and trade policy topic?
Okay. Well, and don't hesitate to cut me off if it turns out I'm still not coming out well. So I would just say that, sort of the continued uncertainty and, particularly around the China issue where, you really do have a bipartisan consensus and sort of what has emerged a really strategic rivalry. So firms are just going to have to, I think, deal with that and manage to that. And so I think, it's a combination of understanding the geopolitical trade policy risks, having kind of mechanisms in place to sort of manage to that, and then, translating that into operational changes. So, sort of what we've been hearing about, how do you collaborate further, visibility, enhancing your use of digital tools, AI, blockchain, et cetera. Some of these, innovations that, I think will help companies manage more complicated environment that, past 20 years was sort of a more benign, multilateral, globalizing world, and that's just not where we are now, and it's hard to see us returning to that going forward.
Thanks very much, Doug. Your audio came in great, by the way. We should have had you reboot right at the very beginning. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour, so if we could maybe go back to the slides, I thought I'd leave the audience with a couple of resources that they might find useful. Here we go. Just as a reminder, Oxford Analytica's Global Horizon Conference in London in March. It should be an incredible event, especially given all the ambiguity and uncertainty that we've had in 2020. So make sure to read into that a bit and please consider joining us. Also, both Oxford Analytica and the Conference Board are doing a lot of work on COVID-19, whether it's on politics, whether it's on economics, trade, etc. So please feel free to come to either the Conference Board's website, the URL is listed here, or the Oxford Analytica website to read more about some of the thinking of our analysts and economists on what is currently occurring globally. Thank you so much for joining us. We had a great discussion today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Feel free to leave an evaluation of the webcast if you have the time. Thank you very much.